And now I'd like to introduce you to today's featured speaker. Ashlee Humphreys is Associate Professor at Northwestern University's Medill School of Journalism, Media, and Integrated Marketing Communications. And she's a sociologist who examines core topics in consumer behavior and marketing strategy. Her research investigates the role of legal and cultural institutions in markets, the influence of language on consumer judgments of legitimacy, and the factors underlying consumers' satisfaction with online experience. She's the author of a book, Social Media, Enduring Principles, and her work's been published in leading journals such as the Journal of Marketing, Journal of Consumer Research, and Sociology Compass. Welcome, Ashlee.
Hi. Okay, thank you, Gordon. Thanks for that introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you all. I see some familiar names in the attendees, so thank you. Thank you all for coming. So today I'd like to talk a little bit about research that I'm doing and have done in social media. And I'd really like to begin by very basically asking the question, what is social media? In 2006, there were 9 references to this term, social media, in the 3 major U.S. publications. In 2016, there were over 6,000 references to social media in that year in major national newspapers. So, obviously the concept has been something that is entered popular discourse and popular consciousness, and I wanted to start out by kind of giving you my perspective on what that term means and what that is, because it's really sort of the foundation for the book. In terms of the scope of what I want to talk about today, I want to cover a few concepts that are from the book and use them to inform this cultural perspective of social media. And then toward the end, I'll link one of these concepts with some empirical work that I've been doing. So to start us off, what is social media? Much of the focus on social media, particularly in marketing research, comes from data and analytics, right? So there's a focus on gathering data from consumers and using that for predictive modeling, for communications, for things like that. And I wanted to sort of step back from that a bit and think about, well, what is social media to anybody, to you or me? And so I want to begin by just telling this story. So, I decided I wanted to write a book on this topic, and I was thinking about what social media is. But it was in the back of my mind as I took this trip to Tennessee. So I was driving from East Tennessee to Nashville. And you might imagine, since I tell you it's in Tennessee, that it looks like this, that it's green and beautiful. And it actually wasn't. It looked a bit more like this. And so I'm driving, and it starts raining, and then there's just a deluge, a complete flood, and the roads start flooding, and people start slowing down. And so I turned on the radio to get some information about routes, and when I turned it on, I hear the DJ taking a call. And the caller calls in, and she asks the DJ, she says, this is in Tennessee, mind you, hi, I'm trying to come in from the fairgrounds, and I was wondering what the best road to take was. And the DJ, I was surprised to hear this, it's not Yahoo Answers or something, right? But the DJ did not miss a beat. He told her, well, a previous caller had come in from that route and took I-75 and these interstates that he listed off. And she thanked him and hung up. And then a minute later, a caller called him and said that this guy was just coming in from the airport, and he wanted to let the DJ know that Route 21 was closed. And so the DJ noted that down and thanked him and hung up, right? Well, then, of course, another minute later, someone else called for advice, right? So what's the idea here? What I realized in this example is that social media, that this is actually an example of social media. Yes, it's on the radio, which we traditionally consider a mass medium, but what you saw happening was really no different than what you'd see in Consumer Forum or Yahoo Answers or anything that we would actually consider sort of social media, right? So that really led me to think of other examples where we can see that social media has existed before the internet, right? So for example, letters to the editor, of course, are a form of participation of readers into the media and interaction. There are, of course, radio call-in shows. There's this interesting phenomena of rotisserie league baseball, which is a kind of a proto-fantasy baseball. People would write in and do their recruiting through letters. And then lastly, one of my favorite examples is from one of America's first newspapers, Public Occurrences, Foreign and Domestic, which was printed it had 4 sides, and on 3 sides there were texts, there were articles, as you can see in the background here. On the 4th side, it was intentionally left blank. And the reason for this is that the newspaper would sit around in pubs and other public gathering places, and it was meant for people to write on, to share news, weather, gossip, right? It's really not much different from what you might see on someone's Facebook wall, right? So this really leads me to my main argument, which is that social media is really a set of practices for using a particular medium, right? For using media socially. And what do we gain by looking at social media as a set of practices rather than a particular platform? I think we gain a few important things. First of all, I think we gain the ability to use a set of theories and knowledge that we have for understanding social practices that is hundreds, if not thousands of years old. So it's very nice that we can bring over our knowledge of how people operate. Let's say the norms of face-to-face communication. We can use some of that knowledge that comes from sociology and from communications to understand, well, how might you greet someone in an online chat, for example, right? So it's very important, I think, that this kind of carries over, this kind of knowledge. Secondly, adopting this kind of perspective, the idea that social media is a set of practices, can really help us out when platforms change, right? As we know, this is a phenomena that technologically is changing very quickly, and we don't want our knowledge to sort of be trapped, right, in one particular platform, one particular infrastructure. So going forward, I think it's helpful for us to see social media as a set of practices. Now, of course, digital technology has greatly facilitated the existence of communicating socially in this way. And as I'll talk about when we talk about the concept of affordances, there's certainly a way in which digital media has greatly accelerated this process. However, I think we can also see social media in these other forms, and it really will help us to see it as something people do rather than a particular technology. So that, broadly speaking, is the perspective of the book. I wrote the book really to provide a well-grounded academic overview of social media for academics, managers, and students. So what that means is that, it's not a hype book, basically. I wanted this to be, what do we actually know from the social sciences? What kinds of knowledge and theories have been developed to understand this phenomenon, the one that you saw rise so rapidly from 2006 to 2016, and to also provide a framework for going forward, right? So of course, I'm not going to tell you about the whole book. I've selected a few things that I think will be really helpful for informing the main topic of the talk today, which is how do we have a cultural perspective, a culturally informed perspective on social media, one that goes beyond and can actually inform all of our data and analytics research. So I'll be drawing from these 3 chapters here. First, I'll be drawing from 2 concepts that come from Chapter 2, which is about the communications model. And the concept of communications models comes, of course, out of communication theory. And then I'll be talking a bit about something from Chapter 12, cultural representations and rituals. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about digital literacy, which comes from Chapter 7, and link that with some research that I've been doing. Okay, so when we think about social media, what kind of thing is it? What does communications theory tell us about what this is? And it's really a hybrid between interpersonal communication and mass media communication. Interpersonal communication is a body of work that studies how people speak face-to-face, dyadically usually, so one-to-one. This kind of communication is often very personal, very intimate, and very small, right? So here, if you're familiar with like the work of Erving Goffman, that's a classic interpersonal communication approach. On the other hand, of course, we know a lot about mass media communication. So as you know, this is one-to-many communication. Think of the nightly news, for example. It's one producer putting out a message to many people who often don't speak back. It's often considered public, more formal, has a very large audience, right? So social media kind of exists in between these two, and theory about social media exists between these 2 poles, right? And what that means is that it's kind of a hybrid. And I think it'll help us to think about social media in our execution as a hybrid of these two forms. So on the one hand, it's non-dyadic. Often we can speak, yes, we can speak to one person, but often, as we see, this speech is overseen by a third person or many third, fourth, fifth people, right? So it's not exactly dyadic, and it's very rarely strictly private. Of course, the second characteristic of social media that has been much emphasized and we see affecting companies all the time is that it's two-way, right? So rather than a company just putting out a message, the consumers speak back and indeed create their own messages, which can be problematic for a company. And I should say can also be really good for a company when customers have something good to say. So the idea is that communication is, of course, two-way. And then, of course, related to that, it's relatively user-controlled, right? So rather than companies putting out a very polished message, what we see in social media are somewhat rougher messages of just things that consumers have to say. And I'll get to a few cases where we can really see how these affect the management of social media. So just a quick example of what these kinds of characteristics mean, right? This is an example of a tweet that Oprah Winfrey sent to her friend, Gayle King. So you might think it's an example of interpersonal communication, one-to-one, where Oprah is telling her friend who's just started a new show at the time, you know, this is your moment. Good luck, right? Directly to Gayle King. However, unlike an interpersonal communication approach, this is in social media. So we see the interaction between Oprah and Gayle, and this has its reverberations, right? For, in this case, promoting the show. Right? So just kind of an example of how indeed models of communication have changed. And I apologize, you can't see what's behind this, but it used to be that the old model was pretty linear from sender encodes a message, and that message is in a medium, and that just goes to the receiver, right? In contrast, we have now this sort of network, right? And I know we kind of all know this explicitly, but when it really comes to applying it, I think it helps to go back to this kind of idea. So what this kind of network model of communication says is that, for the message to be transmitted in a channel, you actually need people. And so you need to culturally understand and resonate with those people, right? And the idea goes way beyond virality, as we might talk about later, right? It's really about resonating at a cultural level with each one of those people so that your message is transmitted, okay? And I'll talk a little bit about a framework for understanding how that can happen successfully. Okay, so that's really the first concepts that I wanted to talk about are the communication model. The second concept that I think is probably interesting and important for those of us thinking about social media, not only how to research it, but also how to kind of execute and manage it, is the idea of affordances. So I don't know how many of you are familiar with the idea of affordances, but basically it was an idea developed in the 60s and 70s to understand material culture. So something like a chair. What you see in the background here is indeed a chair. And how do we know that this is a chair? The idea of affordances is an affordance is a complementarity between a user's goal and the material object. So for example, this object has the affordance of having a flat, relatively flat seat, we could call it, right? A platform that is lower than knee level to sit, right? So that's a certain congruity between what a user might want to do, which is sit down, and the material properties of the object, right? This chair, it also has a back, a vertical kind of platform to rest one's back against, right? So the idea of an affordance is that there's this complementarity between either physical object or technology and what someone wants to do with it. So we can see that structural properties of technology, they enable some actions and uses while they also constrain others. So for example, we might think about the affordances of, say, a social networking site. What does the infrastructure of a social networking site allow you to do, right? It allows you, say, when they were first developed, social networking sites actually were aimed at the affordances of meeting new people, right? So suggestions were very important. There were certain types of technological properties that helped you meet new people. Or if you think about affordances of something like Match.com, right? There are various searches and filters and technological aspects of the site that are congruent with one's goal of meeting new people, okay? On a social networking site like Facebook, on the other hand, it may have affordances for actually that are more congruent with maintaining social ties, right? So updating on what your friends are doing, for example. Messaging, liking can be an affordance, right, for sort of maintaining that social tie, maintaining that interaction. On the other hand, if we want to think about constraint, we could think about something like Twitter, right? So Twitter has affordances for sharing small things very quickly, being concise, right? It does not really have affordances for writing a long blog post, right? It doesn't really have affordances for extensively networking. All right. So just some examples of how this can apply to marketing. And I think the way that we really think about it when we're thinking about managing social media is you sort of want your affordances to be congruent with what you have to say, right? So here we have on the first example here, don't let this be my hashtag last selfie. This was a campaign on Snapchat, right? And one affordance of Snapchat is that it, the videos only last for a short time, right? And so the affordance of Snapchat was really congruent in this case. This is from the World Wildlife Foundation, was really congruent with the idea of an endangered species, right? And so you get some resonance, again, thinking back to the communication model where you need people to be the channel to circulate the message. You really get a congruence there that resonates and thus can then travel the message, right? So that's sort of what I mean and am getting at when we're talking about a cultural perspective is you're looking to create that kind of deeper resonance. And one way to do that is to have that congruence between the message and the affordance. Here's the second example here is from Starbucks. So this may seem pretty mundane, but I think it's a great example of how Starbucks uses the affordances of Facebook, right? So this comes from a feed where Starbucks is really, they use it for promotion, typical, short-term promotional things, coupons, holidays, things like this, right? Special products. So here they're celebrating National Croissant Day with some flaky, buttery friends. So here it's really more of a short-term kind of sales-driven approach, but completely congruent with the affordances of Facebook where they posted this to, and they also use Twitter in this way too, to provide kind of timely, up-to-date messages, right? This next example from Oreo is actually, it's a little video. It won't play for you, but you could look it up. It's one of these short little videos that shows basically a new product use. So what happens in the video is that they grind up the Oreos, they put them in a pepper grinder, cleaned pepper grinder, and use them to put Oreos over ice cream, right? So it's just an example, and I'm sure many of you have seen these, where you can use a little short video to, in this case, inform consumers about a new product use, right? And then this last example, Burberry, comes from Instagram. And what Burberry does on a channel like Instagram, which is a pretty rich media, it has more affordances for showing pictures, is they do a lot of kind of backstage branding work, right? So whereas the mass media for Burberry might be a glossy magazine ad where you see the front stage of the brand, for Burberry, you see they will often show you behind the scenes designer sketches and things like this, right? And it's really kind of congruent with the affordance of Instagram to provide images, to provide some rich media. I think another thing to consider in terms of creating resonances is the increasing importance of social movements and subcultures to these kinds of messages that circulate well on social media. So, for example, here at the top, you have a Chipotle campaign that was a video, but again, it was a video that is circulated primarily online. But it comes from a deeper resonance with food movements, such as local food movements, right? And shows the process of industrialization and some of the negative impacts of that, right? So yes, present a marketing message, but one that can be really resonant with those who this subculture has touched, right? And indeed, that kind of idea has entered mainstream culture. On the right here, you have Dove. This is the much lauded new beauty movement. So again, it's just another example of taking kind of a strain of culture, a social movement message that to sell Dove, but works particularly well on social media because you need people to move the message along, right? Old Spice similarly uses congruence with a certain kind of humor in youth culture. Okay, so I thought we might just do a few examples where we can look at the congruence of affordances and look at some good examples versus some bad examples. I thought we'd start with the good, right? So I have a short video to play of a campaign from Coca-Cola. So this campaign worked from the iconic I'd like to buy the world a Coke campaign. It was a rethinking of that campaign for not only social media, but it really took a kind of integrated media approach, as you'll see, that included out of home as well. And as you watch the video, I'd like for us to just think about how the particular affordances of the different media used really shaped the campaign, right? And here we may have to wait just a moment for further video. Yeah, I'd like to teach the world to sing. Thanks, Lisa. I'll tell you a little bit more while it loads. I don't know if it's loading for anybody else, but
in Project Rebrief,
we've
reimagined Coca-Cola's classic Hilltop commercial for a modern audience in the digital age.
Google,
in the spirit of the original ad, it allows users to connect with strangers by sending a Coke around the globe to an unsuspecting recipient, making the world feel just a little bit smaller. The ad can be experienced on mobile phone apps in Google's AdMob network across iOS and Android devices. Made possible through AdMob-rich media ads, coupled with custom-designed vending machines, viewers can truly buy the world of Coke with a few taps on their mobile phones. A viewer can decide where to send a Coke by selecting one of many machines located around the world, from New York City to Cape Town to Buenos Aires. They can then add a custom text message to personalize their Coke delivery. Google Translate converts these messages on the fly, breaking down the language barrier across countries. A dynamic video with Google Maps, Street View, and composite motion graphics shows the Coke's journey from the viewer's current location to the vending machine across the globe. Users can then wait for confirmation of their Coke's delivery or enter an email address to be notified later. Once the Coke is delivered, recipients are not only treated to the generosity of a stranger thousands of miles away, but they can also say thanks by sending a message of their own back to the user. That message is then delivered to the user's inbox, where they can read the note and view a video clip of the recipient's surprised reaction upon getting a free Coke. A gallery showcases some of our favorite shareable exchanges between people around the world connecting over a can of Coke.
Thank you, that's the best Coke I've ever had.
Today's technology allows us to make good on a promise Coca-Cola made over 40 years ago, and lets users buy the world of Coke from the palm of their hand.
Okay, great. So as you saw in that video, it was a combination of some of the affordances of, say, Google Translate to translate the message, but also Coke, in this case, created its own affordances through its vending machines, right, to include the ability to send a video message and create that kind of resonance between people, which then Coke used for its brand message, right? Really building on a core brand message of Coke to unite the world, right? So I just thought this was a great example because it is a digital example, but it also is very congruent with just Coke's other, larger strategy and brand positioning, right? And literally embodies that message through the technology, right? So now turning to some of the not so good examples where affordances went terribly awry. You have here on the left the McD stories example. So McDonald's thought it would be a great idea to cultivate a Twitter conversation about good stories at McDonald's, and they created this hashtag and started sharing some. And as you can see, that went awry, right? Because if you ask just people at large on Twitter about what stories they've had at McDonald's, they will probably play on some pretty negative brand meanings about food, et cetera, right? Labor, you see that these things come up, right? So the affordance here of the hashtag, which you might think could lead to some great conversation, was sort of naively employed, you know. An even better case is here, the case on the right for JP Morgan. So this was at, after the financial crisis, good bit after, but it was still sort of on people's minds. And JP Morgan began the hashtag Ask JPM to, what does a hashtag do as an affordance? It strings together these conversations, right, around this particular hashtag. And so as you can see here, the users spoke back in this two-way communication to ask things like, do you feel bad about systematically undermining democracy? Do you know what fiduciary duty is? Things like this, right? Ask JPM, how are you planning to spend the savings made from firing your social media team? So you see that really the affordance of this hashtag worked in the opposite way as it was intended. And then, of course, we have the ugly, right? The social media firestorms where United, I guess, is our poster child now for the social media firestorms, where it's different than the examples previously because it's not a message that the company intends to structure. They don't put something out there. Rather, users create some content that begins circulating very rapidly, again, because of the affordances. So, for example, the recent Daniel Dow example, where he struggled with a plane, we see this very vividly in video, right? If we didn't have that affordance for seeing video, I'm not sure this would have been as big of a firestorm as it was. So why do firestorms happen? This could be a talk into itself, but there are a few factors, and they have to do, of course, with affordances. One is the cycle rate. So this is the idea that it takes maybe 3 seconds to share this video with someone, right? It happens very quickly, and because of that, the pattern is exponential, right? I share it with 3 people. It takes me 3 seconds. Each one of them shares it with 3 people, and it takes 3 seconds. And so you can see how an exponential pattern develops. There's also the effect of crossover, the echo effect. So this is when the story crosses over to mainstream media. And then what we find is that once it crosses over, it has this reverberation into social media because people then start sharing the mainstream media post all over again, right? So mainstream media does have a role to play in these firestorms. And then lastly is the idea of clustering, just the idea that when people are very closely clustered in a network, like that communications model that we showed, things can travel very quickly between them because there are multiple touch points to share the message. So by understanding some of these properties, we can develop a framework for a culturally informed perspective on social media marketing. So just a few things that I've talked about. On the one hand, we have these properties of medium on the right. So we have network properties. I was just talking about clustering, for example. And those exist sort of at the system level. So how people in the aggregate are related to each other. And then we have, regarding the medium, individual or kind of one-off factors like the affordances of a particular medium, right? we also have message factors, of course. So system-wide, there's a cultural environment that the messages, the communication is going into that has certain properties that either resonate or don't with the message, right? And so we saw some examples of that, the JPM example, for example, where the message really was incongruent with the cultural environment, which was very aware of the financial bailout. And then, of course, we have these specific message properties. So at an individual level, how does the message resonate with a particular individual, right? That's obviously shaped by its cultural environment. So you can start to look at some of these interactions between the message and the affordances. So that's, for example, is our selfie, our "Don't let this be the last selfie" from the World Wildlife Foundation, right, where you have the message is congruent with the affordance. You can also look at interactions between the network and the cultural environment. So not only, let's say, how dense is the network, but who are the people in the network and how are they related in terms of, you think of political affiliation or any other kind of psychometric variable, right? So by understanding not only each of these pieces, but I think more importantly how they relate, we can kind of create and manage better, richer, more informed and resonant social media campaigns, right? That go way beyond the targeting individuals based on some data, right? The true breakout successes that we've seen, I believe, really come from truly understanding both the cultural and network environment and creating resonance with the message and affordances. Okay, so in the time I have left, I want to just talk about one more concept, a kind of a sociological understanding of digital literacy, and to link that to some empirical research that we're doing on digital satisfaction. So very briefly, what is digital literacy? The previous research comes, of course, from literacy. So again, this harkens back to the idea that we don't need to completely recreate the wheel. We can use our previous understanding of what literacy means and then apply it to understand digital literacy and modify it accordingly. So traditional literacy is having mastery over the process by means of which culturally significant information is encoded, right? So digital literacy makes a huge difference, just even in the most mundane tasks, getting health information, for example, managing your bank account, paying your bills, all kinds of things, getting information, right, news information. Digital literacy can make a huge difference in people's lives, and it's really varied. It's not an either or. There are really shades of it. Now, how do we understand those shades? Digital literacy, I'd say, unlike what one might naively sort of think when I say literacy, it's understandable you would think of just the ability to read, the ability to decode a language that's written. That's a pretty traditional definition, and we really think of that as alphanumeric literacy, the ability to read and write a language. But as you can see, when we start to think about how multifaceted digital literacy is, it can include things like computer literacy, so the ability to use the computer, the mouse, to prevent viruses, things like this, right? Delete spam. It can include CMC literacy, or computer-mediated communication literacy. So this is the ability to read and write, interpret acronyms, for example, like what LOL means or SMH, right? There's a special kind of vernacular that it's helpful to understand, let's say, if you're posting on a message board, right? Then I think the other sort of last component to really emphasize here is information literacy. So this is the ability to effectively search for, access, and understand digital information. And this really is about appreciating and being able to find relevant information, right? Also to have sort of this, which as we've learned, we don't always have, this perspective that, well, I may be living in a filter bubble, right? I may only be getting access to certain kinds of information, and to try to think outside that and be able to search outside that. That would also be under information literacy. So as you can see, digital literacy is pretty complex and can really have huge effects on one's life and goals. So how do we understand this from a sociological perspective? It really comes back to cultural capital. And I won't spend a great deal of time talking about cultural capital, but the idea is cultural capital, it's a deeply socialized set of knowledge, tastes, and practices that create a sense of your social class and a sense of affiliation between you and others, right? And the important part to emphasize here is the idea of embodied cultural capital. So this in digital literacy manifests as, of course, spending time developing your computer skills, but also a kind of natural interest in computers and media. Because it's so socialized, it feels natural, right? And then this last line here, a sense of trust or distrust of certain sources. So there's almost sort of an intuitive sense that highly digitally literate people have that, oh, you can trust this or you can't, right? And as we've seen, that's really actually very tricky. We don't all have, I think there's been kind of a lot of self-reflection on our own amounts of digital literacy. Okay, so the key question that I had, this is sort of a sociological approach on digital literacy, and the question that I had was, how is digital literacy related to digital satisfaction? And I'm not going to take you through, there's a measure of digital satisfaction that I've developed in some other work, and I was really just curious, well, how does digital literacy impact your ability to have satisfying online experiences, right? So what is digital satisfaction? I will say that for another report, I can certainly refer you to volumes about what is digital satisfaction. We've done a very large project to determine kind of what are the components of digital satisfaction on this scale, from relevant, enjoying, empowering experiences on the one hand to intrusive, annoying, irritating, or pushy experiences. We have a scale, essentially, that we've developed. And I won't spend too much time talking about that, but there are basically 4 factors of digital satisfaction. One of them is trust. So how much do you trust the information you're getting? The other is utility. So how useful is the tool that you're using to you? Privacy. So are you concerned about your privacy, say, using this tool or interacting with this company? And then lastly, social. How fulfilling are your connections with others on this platform or with this company, right? So I apologize. I'm going to skip over some of the top line results from the Digital Satisfaction Index, for example, the U.S., or in comparison between other countries, between the U.S. here, the United Kingdom, Germany, and China. We can kind of create a score for digital satisfaction and compare that across all sorts of not only countries but also industries. And skip right to the point, which is, as you might expect, indeed, as digital literacy increases, people have more satisfying experiences. That's probably not too surprising, right? Rather, what we were really interested in is, A, does this happen across categories? So as you can see, that pattern is true for most of the categories we tested, and we have 4 other ones where it came out. So automotive, electronics, and QSR, quick service restaurants, that is indeed the case. But also, and I also want to kind of emphasize that digital literacy, you might be thinking, well, it's just a proxy for education or age, right? That younger people are more digitally literate and we can just use age. In fact, no. So just when you put it in a regression, the effect of digital literacy is a distinct and significant factor when it comes to predicting digital satisfaction, and indeed is about the same magnitude as either education or education or age, right? And then lastly, what we learned, what I was particularly interested in, is the 4 factors that I mentioned. How does digital literacy impact one's satisfaction with utility, with these different components? And what we see here is pretty interesting, I think. So we see the pattern where people who are highly literate are more satisfied with utility. They find these tools more useful. That makes sense. Same thing for privacy and social. But what's interesting here is you see for trust, these are 3 levels of digital literacy, low, medium, and high, and their satisfaction with trust online. And so you see the middle people are more highly satisfied, which I think is kind of interesting. The way I think about it is an example of the Dunning-Kruger effect, sort of, where you kind of know a little bit, but you don't know what you don't know, essentially. And so that can impact really people's of trust. For these medium literate people, they're maybe more trusting or more satisfied with trust online, right? So just to wrap up here, pertaining to digital literacy in particular, digital literacy, it's a complex sociological trait, and it's affected by one's cultural capital. It has a significant effect on your digital satisfaction, and it exerts an influence that's distinct from, but sometimes related to age, really age and education, right? So just in conclusion, where does this leave us? I hope the talk has given you an appreciation for some of the cultural and sociological factors online, beyond the technological and beyond the sort of data-centered aspects that we tend to so often emphasize. And I hope you found a few of these concepts useful for thinking in new ways about managing and executing social media. All right, that's it. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Ashlee. This is Gordon. One thing I'd like to remind everybody of is if you have questions you'd like to pose, please send them directly through your chat with presenter function in the left-hand corner of your screen. I might kick things off with a couple things that have occurred to me. This is sort of coming at it from a practitioner standpoint. It seems like, companies may still be using some of the traditional sort of guidance about different media, reach and frequency, for example. And I think what you're saying through your many examples is that all these different media are very different in terms of the character that they have, or the affordance, the alignment of the goals with the environment, the goals they're trying to achieve with them in the environment. So I'm wondering if you can help draw the connections maybe for somebody doing media planning. How would they take these things into account in terms of selecting different types of social media to achieve those goals? I think you've given some great examples. I'm trying to draw out, how an actual media planner might think of these things differently. And just one other thought on that is, like, for example, I've worked with some companies where they will have a TV ad that they've spent a lot of money developing, and it's great for mass purposes, and then they'll say, well, now what do we do for social? And the starting point might be just to extract a piece of it. But I think the implications of what you're saying are that's probably not the way to go. So anyway, any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So here I've talked a lot about sort of execution and not as much about measurement and planning, but it's really, you can imagine, it's pretty complex when you get into all the different types of media and how you might measure success in each one. And of course, there are measures of so-called engagement, like likes or follows or retweets, and as we've seen, those can be manipulated. But I think what's important to keep in mind from a cultural perspective is that sort of interaction between, for example, if you're looking at follows, for example, as your metric, I think it's important to also see who those people are or where the follows are coming from. So, for example, you can combine a measure of influence where you see how many followers do the people who followed you have, right? And sort of integrate some of those measures to really triangulate on, is this successful in the way you think it is, right? So I hope it makes sense, kind of like triangulating measures of not only volume, like how many people like this, but also those sorts of network properties, like who those people were in terms of their influence.
So I think the implications are, instead of looking at things in mass, like, the traditional reach frequency measures, you've really got to dig down into individual metrics that have different properties, like I said, retweeting, or, just how many people we're reaching or how many posts are made is not sufficient to really understand effectiveness, at least in today's world, where there's all these different new media or new platforms to try out.
Yeah, exactly. I think you really have to use your metrics to build a picture, like a full picture of how the campaign went.
Yeah. Just one other follow-up, which is related to both things that you've raised, the affordances and then the digital literacy, and also picking up on this sort of market segmentation notion. When we read, let's say in the popular press about what's being said on social media, and you make the point that the area, the degree of literacy is quite variable, is it even fair to say, are we getting an accurate picture of what people really believe when we listen to that? Or do you need to look at people by literacy? You need to look at the very sophisticated people versus the, maybe the broad masses of the population divided into some segments. Kind of wondering about that, given a lot of the publicity we're hearing these days, which seems to have taken off, in the last year compared to what it was previously. It's kind of like your trajectory from 2006 on, but this year has been an exceptionally large increase. So curious on your thoughts on that. How do we read what's going on in social media, knowing that there are these different degrees of literacy underneath to worry about?
Yeah. If I understand the question correctly, I think there is a little bit of a crisis of measurement when it comes to thinking about, for example, if we're using Twitter data, what does that mean? Who are those
people?
It's like,
and this is somewhat of a parallel set of questions, but people are saying, is social media, the equivalent of what used to be the survey research that was a key driver of marketing strategy? Is it data? Is it real? And what universe does it represent?
Yes, absolutely. And I think we've seen pretty conclusively that it does not represent, let's say, the population. If you want to go for a measure of the population in the U.S., it's very difficult to get that truly online, right? You have to be aware of your different publics, different segments of the population that may not be as available online as, say, if you picked up the phone, right? So, yes, every methodology sort of has its own selection biases, but I think it's important to bear in mind, let's say if you are particularly with Twitter, that Twitter is a very specific segment of the population that overrepresents for things like age, income, also cultural capital, actually, with Twitter users having more. So, you really have to be aware of that. Certain other platforms like Facebook are a little more democratic. I think, I forget exactly what the percentage is, but I think it's 80-some% use Facebook, of the U.S. population uses Facebook. So it's a little better, but on the other hand, then you have barriers to data accessibility. So it's much harder to study Facebook text, for example.
Yeah. Well, we've just gotten a question here from a member of our audience that kind of extends that point, which is for a practitioner looking at different kinds of campaigns, how do you do a comparative evaluation when you're using Twitter, ratings, reviews, Facebook, et cetera, if you've got all these different constraints, different affordances? What kind of guidance, if any, at this point, can you give to, let's say, practitioners first, and we come to the academics, in terms of how do you deal with all those different types of formats and how you evaluate them?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I would say two things. I think the first thing I would say, and especially, you know, when I teach social media management, one thing I really try to emphasize is that different social media often have different purposes, or kind of can and should have different managerial purposes, right? So using an Instagram campaign will often resonate differently than if you did a Facebook or Twitter. And so there are sort of different ways to use each media when you're executing your strategy, right? Whether it be for brand building, that would be maybe more Instagram, versus transactional, that might be a little more Twitter or Facebook, right? So there are kind of different places for these social media in a strategy. And so in that sense, you sort of measure them according to the goal of the strategy, right? So if your goal was branding, then it would be to track brand perceptions, you know. So to some degree, you're absolutely right that the media kind of the affordances can determine the goal, the use, and also the measurement. However, I mean, the second part of the answer is I do realize, of course, you want to compare across media, right, with that qualification. So interestingly, we've seen some convergence, of course, amongst the major platforms, where you saw Twitter went to the heart instead of the star, right, to indicate like positive endorsement. So, you know, we're seeing some convergence where I think there's compatibility on a few metrics that you can get, say, likes to hearts or whatever, but that will probably always be that data will be pretty scarce in terms of your ability to look at it across media, just because they're different companies and different platforms, you know. One last thing, I know we're out of time, but I would say also sentiment and text can be a way. Everybody online almost uses text. Often people use text, and you can use that as if you can quantify that text through sentiment or something else, you can look at that across media.
Great. Well, that's very helpful, and it kind of ties back to some of your original points about understanding the media and the components of them. So thanks very much, Ashlee. We're kind of at time. If we didn't get to some of your questions from the audience, or if there are additional things you'd like to discuss, we do invite you to reach out to Ashlee at a-humphreys@northwestern.edu. Our next webinar will be with how to use common customer metrics to enhance firm valuation models, and this will feature Pete Fader of the University of Pennsylvania on May 15th, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Many thanks again to the members of the MSI audience for participating in our member-to-member webinar series.